Bit of surprising SCOTUS news earlier this week. They struck down a Republican-drawn map for congressional districts in Alabama that they say violates the Voting Rights Act. And considering the makeup of the Supreme Court, how conservative it's become, particularly on issues of voting, this was truly a surprise. But it was a 5-4 vote. You had 2 of the conservatives joining the 3 liberals. That's John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. So now the map is going to have to be redrawn. In terms of the actual distribution of seats, I don't know how much of a difference this is going to make. I think it might have ended up being like 6-1 or 7-1 or something like that. But it might end up swaying, 1 seat to the Democrats. But more importantly, rather than just the partisan result of it, the allegation was that this map was drawn to try to intentionally dilute the voting power of black voters in Alabama. And regardless of whatever the partisan outcome of this is, you cannot do that. That's what the Voting Rights Act is supposed to stop. And so it is good to see that there are still some in the Supreme Court that care about that. Although, as we will cover, not everybody does. And so Roberts wrote for the majority in this, said that a lower court had correctly concluded that the map violated the voting rights law. He wrote that there are genuine fears that the Voting Rights Act may impermissibly elevate race and the allocation of political power, so don't get too cozy with him going forward. And that the Alabama ruling does not diminish or disregard those concerns. Instead, it simply holds that a faithful application of our precedents and a fair reading of the record before us do not bear them out. So he's a little bit hesitant, but votes the right way. That's the majority opinion. Clarence Thomas writes a dissent. It's 48 pages long, and it is fairly clear that if it were up to him, Voting Rights Act wouldn't exist, or at the very least, it would have no ability whatsoever to stop some of the most racist politicians in America from explicitly drawing congressional maps intended to minimize the voting power of minorities. Brett, what do you think?
So when the founders of this nation wrote the rules of this nation, the one thing you can undeniably conclude by reading the result of a revolution against a tyrannical dictator and a ton of corruption, is they were like, we have to write rules that make it very difficult to cheat. Now, they did have a lot of blind spots. They like owned slaves and stuff, but they were like, even then they were like, we should make it really difficult to cheat. And cheating, like a bacteria, eats away at things like institutions over time. And they don't just show up and say like, I'm breaking this rule right now. There's a lot of rules that keep people from cheating and stealing elections. But over time, what the right wing has done in this country is invest a lot of money to try to find sophisticated ways to win, even though we all know that like this rich, horrible group of people will say explicitly when you ask them behind the scenes, should everyone get a vote? They say no. If we gave everyone a vote, then they would take all my money and there wouldn't be any opportunity for me. I'm very disenfranchised as a bajillionaire. And so I understand their instincts to kind of protect their interests, but even the Supreme Court, which is stacked so hard against this and is the result of the exact bacterial process that I referenced earlier to cheat at the system, even these guys are like, what Alabama did was so counter to even what the slave-holding founders of this country put on paper, that it created a framework where we could have a Voting Rights Act that would ban this kind of thing from happening. And they acted, and rather than go and tilt your swords at the conservative justices who betrayed you if you're on the right wing, what you should do is look at yourself and say, oh my God, we are big old stinky cheaters.
That's definitely one way to put it, yeah. By the way, like looking forward, not that it'll matter, like if a certain sort of conservative justice is able to dominate the court and have their way, like Clarence Thomas, like he says that he's long been convinced that the Voting Rights Act only regulates voters' ability to actually get to the ballot or cast it, meaning that you cannot literally have a line of white people lock arms and stop you from getting to the polling place. But once you get there, your vote can have been intentionally structured so that it will be irrelevant. That's fine. That is his idea. If they were to take, so they're worried that someday, obviously there's all this like white fear or whatever, that someday white people will be the minority in America. If and when that comes, if the new black-brown alliance that forms the majority decides that they're going to gerrymander every part of the country so the white people can technically get to the ballot, but it won't matter when they vote, there will have been decades of Republican precedent for that being cool. That's perfectly fine. It just comes down to, do you have the majority? If there's enough of your race that gets to enforce their will in the others, then it's all legal, it's all cool, no problems with the Constitution. And super fast final point goes to you.
Right, my point is that like in Alabama in the 2020 election, it was 1/3 Democrat and 2/3 Republican. So you think that the way that the legislature in that state or the representatives they elect to DC, it would be somewhat close to that, but it's actually half of that. It's 1-7 or 1-6, and that's crazy. And yeah, and they're just like fundamentally, and so that's the thing that's horrible. That is the big like this is what's wrong moment. And then you look at how the black population is distributed across the state. They call it the Black Belt in Alabama. It's right across the middle, is where most of the black population lives. And then you look at how the districts are drawn. It just utterly divides them up and siphons them off into other groups.
Yeah, purposely, yeah, 100%. So that's fun, but thankfully, at least in this case, the Supreme Court did the right thing.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.